there, AP Euro students, and welcome to today's lecture. This is part of Unit 0, the Middle Ages, and today's topic is Section 0.1, a general overview of the course themes and timeline of Western civilization and the Middle Ages. So the first major topic we're going to look at are the course themes. There are 7 course themes that we will be using in AP European history to help us organize the course and help us categorize and understand different events and different people and the relationships. These themes are a really, really good way of organizing and understanding history. So the first theme we're looking at is social organization and development. We'll frequently just refer to this as the social theme. This theme includes topics like social class, gender roles and relations, social hierarchy, social mobility and barriers, racial and ethnic constructs, family, kinship, health, urbanization, education, attitudes towards children and how to raise children, and also LGBT history whenever we have a chance to include it. Now, these social topics are often closely connected with political and economic themes. You'll find that very rarely do these themes stand independently of each other. More often, they're very closely connected and overlap with one another. So some examples we will see with the social theme, even in some of our more immediate topics. When we look at women's roles and their rights throughout history, that's part of a social theme. Also, the way the social classes will change between the early modern era as we move into the Industrial Revolution. You'll see we go from the 3 estates to 2 bigger groups called the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So those are a couple examples, how the role of women changes, how social class and social groups change throughout history. We're going to see basically examples of this theme in every unit that we study. The next unit is not the next unit, excuse me, the next theme is political states and other institutions of power. So we're going to call this our political theme. This includes topics like government structures, different types of government structures. For example, monarchies, empires, republics, parliaments, democracies, right? Things like that. Also, different leaders of government, kings and queens, presidents, prime ministers. This topic also includes wars and treaties, revolutions, the rise of nationalism, the development of laws and court systems. But notice how this theme is political states and other institutions of power. So that means there's other institutions of power beyond governments that can be very influential in European history. First and foremost would be the church. And when we say the church, we primarily mean the big Catholic Church, which we'll learn all about later on. This can also include guilds. Guilds were sort of like early labor organizations from the Middle Ages. City governments. These are all examples of your non-traditional institutions of power. So some examples that we will encounter with the political theme: the rise of the new monarchs during the Renaissance in the 16th century at the beginning of the modern era. Also, the development of absolute monarchs, as these monarchs are able to consolidate their power and have extensive control over their entire countries. We'll learn about Louis XIV, excuse me, in his Grand Palace at Versailles. We'll also learn about the Catholic Church and its power throughout history and how that power then is eventually weakened and challenged by the Protestant Reformation. And then, of course, the many, many wars that take place in European history fall under the political theme. The Wars of the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and then, of course, World War I and World War II. Our next theme is known as Interactions of Europe and the World. This theme we will probably not see in every single unit, but when we do see it, it will be very, very obvious. So this theme includes topics like exploration, colonization, imperialism, also war, It can also include trade, and really the causes and the effects of war and trade on both on Europe and on non-European peoples. This theme will also explore the attitudes that Europeans have towards non-European peoples. So when we discuss themes like racism and slavery, that will be a major component of this theme. So some examples that we will see of this theme, especially early on in the course, includes the European conquest and colonization of the Americas in the 15th and 16th century, and how that led to the development of the slave trade and widespread slavery in the Americas. And the other major event associated with this theme happens later in the 19th century, when Europe then turns its sights onto Africa and conquers and colonizes Africa in the 19th century during the age of imperialism. We'll learn about that topic in second semester. Our next theme is then cultural and intellectual developments. This is one of my personal favorite themes because it's so interesting, and again, we'll see it in just about every unit that we study. This theme includes topics like art, music, literature, philosophy, religion, language, clothing and clothing styles, food, anything that is part of a culture. So some examples of this will be all of the art that we study. We frequently get to study art in AP European history. We'll start with the art of the Italian Renaissance, which is beautiful and magnificent and fascinating. All through the next few centuries, we'll see art periodically in our units that we get to study. And then also another major topic that is applicable to this theme is known as the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is when Europe sort of starts to become more modern in its thought and start to consider ideas about liberty and equality. And the Enlightenment is a really fascinating movement that will influence major events like the creation of the United States and the French Revolution and changes in social class. It's really a major turning point in European history. It's very, very influential. But we'll learn all about that event and more later on. The next topic, or the next theme, I should say, is economic and commercial developments. So this includes topics like currency, so different types of money, wealth distribution, so obviously you can see how that would relate to social classes, agriculture, industrialization, trade, capitalism, communism, mercantilism, tariffs, and banking. So anything that has to do with money or commerce, commerce is another word for business, will fall into the economic theme. So we will see many examples of this in basically every unit that we study. As early as Unit 1, we will see some major topics and examples, like the creation of the World Trade Network between Europe and the Americas that is, of course, dominated by Europeans. And really, that trend of European-dominated trade continues throughout the modern era until we get to the 20th century. Our next theme is identity. Now, this is an interesting theme, identity. This refers to both national identity and also collective European identity. So a national identity refers more to the idea that someone is French or someone is Italian or German, right? And that national identity often is defined by a sense of nationalism, a sense of pride. You can think of sort of like a patriotism, a connection to their country. This might be also defined by language and culture. But even beyond that, we will find that Europe is not, the concept of the nation state in European history doesn't really emerge until the 19th and the 20th centuries, or even the 18th and 19th, 20th centuries, a little bit later in the course. During the Middle Ages and the early modern era, European identity was much more regional, right? So, for example, people did not necessarily identify themselves as being Italian. They would think of themselves as Sicilian or Roman or Neapolitan, referring to a specific province or region inside of Italy. And consequently, that type of identity could prevent some of these bigger nation states from unifying. Nation states like Italy, we will learn that Italy does not unify and become a proper state until the 19th century. But also, when we explore this idea of identity, really we're asking ourselves, like, what does it mean to be Italian, or what does it mean to be French? Like, how do we define that identity and what influences it, right? And then later on in the course, by the time we get to the 20th century, we'll be looking at the development of a common European identity. What does it mean to be European? Um, and this coincides with the development of common European institutions like the European Union, which is a very, very recent development and remarkable development in European history that you'll appreciate once we have studied 600 years of conflict and war and strife of European history. So this theme is not as obvious to identify as, say, the social theme, the political theme, the economic theme, or even the cultural theme, right? This is a more subtle theme that we kind of have to reflect on, we have to think about. Sometimes it might be more obvious, obviously, when we get to the rise of nationalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, and the formation of nation states, and especially really aggressive nationalism. For example, that aggressive nationalism produces, Hitler and the Nazis, who wanted to make Germany the greatest country in the world and dominate the planet with the Third Reich. All of that is connected to this theme of identity. For them, it was German identity. But it's going to be really interesting to explore this theme at various points throughout the course. And I hope you're able to enjoy this theme and play with it, and just kind of let it develop throughout the course, right? Look for examples of ways we can consider and define various types of identity throughout European history. Because if we do that in this course, then it becomes much easier for us to consider what influences, what defines concepts of identity within human history and within the human experience. And there's lots of very relevant connections we can make to that, and lots of fascinating discussions that we can have. But anyways, moving on. Our final theme is technology or technological and scientific innovation. So this theme includes examples of technology, so things like shipbuilding, map making, the development of artistic tools, or the development of agricultural tools, the development of machines that would lead to the rise of factories. Also, scientific developments. So the first emergence of real science in the 16th and 17th centuries, the discussion about famous scientists like Nicholas Copernicus and Galileo Galilei, the new ideas in astronomy, new ideas in mathematics, the developments of physics and medicine and biology, developments in agriculture as well. All these scientific developments are very, very important for bringing Europe into the modern era and helping Europe become really the most powerful civilization on the planet until we get to at least the 20th century and the world wars. So we're going to see lots of examples of technology. It's going to be in almost every unit that we study. It may not be the most obvious topic, like political or economic themes, but it's still going to be there. So you have to keep an eye out for it. But some examples of this theme that we'll see early on include the development of new navigational equipment like the compass that would allow Europeans to partake in overseas exploration and actually cross the Atlantic Ocean to conquer the Americas. Later in second semester, we'll look at the development of the Industrial Revolution and how the invention of the steam engine transforms manufacturing in Europe, and how that ultimately will transform every other aspect of life, the political, the social, the economic. And that's a major, major turning point in European history that we'll get to explore later on. So at this point, what I'd like you to do is to pause the lecture for just a moment and take a few minutes to answer this reflection question. So you won't always you'll have different types of writing assignments and prompts throughout your lectures. Some might be a write-up at the end of the lecture. Some might be some review questions or reflection questions sprinkled throughout the lecture. But you always want to stop and take a couple minutes to think about what we've learned and reflect. This is a way to kind of let your brain catch up. So this reflection question asks, why is this history course divided into themes like this, the 7 themes that we just discussed? How might these themes help you learn and understand history? How might they influence or structure your own study techniques for this class? So like I said, go ahead and pause the lecture, take a couple minutes to consider this, and when you are ready, go ahead and press play to resume, and we'll get into the second half of the lecture. All right, moving on to the second half of the lecture. This is where we start to explore the timeline of Western civilization, and we'll look very specifically at the timeline of the Middle Ages. So this first image you can see right away gives you a very basic overview of the 3 periods, 3 eras, we could say, of Western civilization: the ancient period, the medieval period, and the modern period. And this, they even do a nice, do you a favor of helping you identify what are considered to be the major turning points. So what are the events that we consider to be the major turning points, or the causes that create these transitions in history? And we'll talk more about those turning points as we look at the timeline more closely. So there's a couple topics I want to go over with you before we look more specifically at the ancient, medieval, and modern eras. So the first is basically the system of dating that we use in Western civilization. Basically, it's using the terminology of BCE and CE. So the timeline of Western history is organized around one major event, which is the birth of Jesus Christ. So traditionally, history has been dated using the BC and AD identifiers. BC stands for before Christ. So that refers to all history that took place before the birth of Christ in year 1. So you can see on this image on the screen, so that's everything to the left of the dotted yellow line in the middle. And then AD would stand for Anno Domini, which is Latin, and it means the year of our Lord. And that refers to any history that took place from year 1, the birth of Christ, to the present day. However, more recently, historians have changed this terminology from BC to BCE and from AD to CE because these are slightly more secular terms. Secular means non-religious. So BCE means before Common Era, so this is before the birth of Christ, and CE means the Common Era, after the birth of Christ. Yes, this is still a very Christian-centric method of organization, but at least the terminology is now more secular. Now in AP Euro, all of the history that we study will fall in the Common Era. So when we are writing dates, we do not need to use the CE abbreviation. We're just going to know that everything we're studying is in the Common Era. Now this next bullet point is actually a term I created, soft dates versus hard dates, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about some of the different transitions in history. So again, these are terms that I use in class. You're probably not going to hear many other historians or teachers use these terms when talking about history. So soft dates are what I call these more gradual transitions. So if something is a soft date, that means things happened around that time. It means the transition was very slow and very gradual. The characteristics of one time period may linger on in different areas longer than others for maybe even a few decades or even a few centuries. So soft dates are, an example of soft dates is a transition between these different time periods. So from ancient to medieval, from medieval into modern, right? Or when we look more closely in the modern period, the transition from the Renaissance into the Reformation, or from the early modern period into the industrial period. So again, gradual transitions that are not universal. Whereas hard dates, these are dates where we know something happened, like an event definitely happened that year. These can be birth and death dates, wars, revolutions. Like, no one's going to argue that this thing happened this year. The French Revolution began in 1789. World War I began in 1914, right? These are dates we do not argue with. And most dates we discuss during the course will be hard dates unless I say otherwise, unless I say it's a soft date or it's a transition. Now, one other point I want to explain to you, and this is important because this issue can sometimes really confuse students. And this is the way we talk about different centuries. So you need to be able to understand this terminology and this logic because I'm going to be using these terms interchangeably when I refer to different centuries. So you may be wondering, if I say the 16th century, why does that mean the 1500s? Wouldn't the 16th century mean the 1600s? That's really confusing. But let's look at the 21st century and kind of count back, and you'll start to understand why. So the 21st century puts us in the 2000s. That means the 20th century was the 1900s. The 19th century is the 1800s. The 18th century is the 1700s, and so on and so on. We really don't go beyond, or we don't really start talking about major events before the 15th century, maybe the 14th century a little bit. But basically, when you hear me say something like the 18th century, just remember that it's one less number. Okay, it's like it's the 1700s. Now again, that can be confusing, but you've got to be comfortable with this because I will say 1700s or 18th century or 1900s or 16th century at any point, and you have to know what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's look more closely at these different big periods in history, these major eras. So the first major era in Western history is ancient history. And ancient history takes place from about 3000 BCE to 500 CE, that abbreviation of CA period, that refers to circa. So that's an indication that these are soft dates because these are the approximate dates of when this period in history began and ended. Now, this marks the beginning of recorded history. Recorded history means the development of writing, and we have about 5,000 years of recorded human history. Obviously, there is history that takes place before this, like the Neolithic and Paleolithic periods, but those are not part of what we consider to be recorded history because they had not yet developed a system of writing. But ancient history begins with the city-states of Mesopotamia. It includes early periods like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age. But really, the focus of ancient history is what we call classical antiquity. And that more specifically refers to the civilizations surrounding the Mediterranean Sea from about 800 BCE to 500 CE. These are seen as the first major European civilizations, and you probably can identify these buildings or at least have an idea of their connections. This period of classical antiquity primarily refers to the development of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, both the Republic and Empire periods. And of course, we have the Parthenon and the Colosseum, two of the most famous buildings from antiquity. And notice I just referred to this period as antiquity and not ancient history. You'll hear me use that term often, the classical period or antiquity. It all refers to this period in history. Now, the reason I'm taking a moment to highlight classical antiquity is because ancient Greece and ancient Rome are going to be very, very influential in the beginning of the modern era, specifically with the development of the Renaissance and Renaissance ideas about philosophy and art that really come to define the beginning of the modern era. Now, the end of the ancient history period, the end of antiquity, is generally considered to be the fall of Rome, and that brings us into medieval history. So the fall of Rome is interesting because we can consider that to be both a hard date and a soft date. the Roman Empire had been declining for about 1 to 2 centuries before the actual city of Rome was conquered by the barbarians. So the actual city of Rome fell in 476 CE, which is largely considered the official date of the fall of Rome, but really the empire was in decline for centuries before that. And that is what kicks off the Middle Ages or medieval history, which takes place from about the year 500, the 5th century, all the way to, let's say, the 15th century. Again, very, very soft dates here. Now, the Middle Ages sees a regression of European civilization, right? So Europe actually weakens. Civilization goes backwards, and so we'll look at how we divide up the Middle Ages more specifically in a few more slides. But again, think of this as a period of regression, a period of backwardsness, a period of recovery. This is also a time where we see the rise and the dominance of Christianity and the Christian church. So even though there's a lot of regression and a lot of backwardsness, at the same time, the Middle Ages are a very formative period in the culture and character of European civilization. Now, the Middle Ages will end with the Renaissance, right? So the Renaissance begins in Italy in the 15th century, in the 1400s. But we have to recognize that the transition out of the medieval era is very, very gradual and may take a few centuries even in different parts of Europe. And there's generally a few events beyond the Renaissance that help identify the transition out of medieval and into modern. And we'll explore those topics another day. And then finally, the period that we will be studying in AP Euro is modern history, the modern era, which takes place from about the 15th century, so the 1400s, all the way to the present day. I don't know. We'll talk about that here in a moment. So, like I said, the modern period begins with the Renaissance, or maybe even the Reformation, or the Scientific Revolution, or the Age of Exploration, major events that are considered to be big turning points, meaning they change everything about European civilization. Maybe not immediately, maybe not overnight and with everyone, but their effects are widespread and long lasting. Everything we study in AP Euro is the modern era, right? So AP Euro is modern European history. So that means aside from Unit 0, we don't learn about Greece or Rome or the Middle Ages really at all. And frankly, I only teach Unit 0, which is a short unit about the Middle Ages, so that we have some prior knowledge, so that we have some context to understand how the modern era is different and why the modern era is significant. So the modern era can even be divided into two different periods. First, we have the early modern era, or early modern history, and that's about the first 300 years, from about 1450 to 1750. Again, those are soft dates. Now, the turning point that takes us out of the early modern era and into the industrial period, or you might call it the more modern era, I should say, but really it's the industrial period, is the development of the Industrial Revolution. So the development of the Industrial Revolution is really that major turning point from early modern into industrial. And so that's about 1750 to the 20th century. Now, whether or not we are still in the modern era is a subject for debate, right? Maybe we still are in the modern era, or maybe the modern era ended in the 20th century and we are now in a different era of history. So that brings us to our next reflection question. So are we still in the modern era, or have we moved on to a new era in history? If we are in a new era, what would it be called? And what would be the cause for this new era? And what would be the defining characteristics of this new era in history? So again, take a moment now to pause the lecture and take a couple minutes to write down your response to this reflection question. And when you're done, go ahead, press play, and resume the lecture, and we'll begin our final slide, which is the timeline of the Middle Ages. And now we're going to begin our last slide, the timeline of the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages, which take place from about the 5th to the 15th century, so 500 to 1500, is actually divided into three different periods itself. The first period is what we call the early Middle Ages, and this is about the first 500 years of medieval history. It begins with the fall of Rome, 476 CE. Of course, this is the event that is seen as the end of the classical period in Western civilization. However, this date only applies to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Actually, if we move forward to this slide, you will see that all of this area in yellow on the right side of your screen, that's an area that we refer to as the Eastern Roman Empire. And that area will continue on, although it becomes known now as the Byzantine Empire, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. And the Byzantine Empire will continue until 1453. So it will last for another 1,000 years after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And this is one of the many reasons we see major cultural and historical differences between Eastern and Western Europe. Now, back to the early Middle Ages. For most of Western Europe, this is considered the Dark Ages, right? This is when we really see that regression of civilization, that backwardsness. There is no cohesive political, social, or economic structure in Western Europe. There are very few cultural or intellectual developments, right? It is really, really a dark time because there's no learning, there's no growth. It's just a time when people are trying to survive. In this early medieval period, Germanic tribes, the barbarians, as the Romans called them, had invaded the Roman Empire. This is one of the things that caused the fall of the empire, obviously, and they had begun to settle throughout Europe. So again, if we go to this slide here, the map of Europe, you can see on the left side, there's a couple different regions where those Germanic tribes had settled, like the Ostrogoths in what we consider to be modern-day Italy, the Burgundy in parts of southern France, the Franks in northern France. Guess what? That's how France gets its name. The Visigoths over in the Iberian Peninsula. So these Germanic tribes had begun to settle throughout Europe. And therefore, political leaders were really tribal chieftains. And these civilizations were, frankly, very rudimentary governments based on a series of oaths and loyalty, right? So this is really the beginnings of what will be feudalism, which is the government structure, the political structure of the Middle Ages, when we will talk about that more later this week. However, most people, like your average person, most people were subsistence farmers in small villages clustered around more powerful lords, right? So most people were just, farmers trying to survive. They lived in small villages. They were protected by a nobleman or a lord. And this is really what we'll see are the beginnings of manorialism. And we'll talk about that actually in the next lecture. But here is actually one of the most important things to know about the early Middle Ages. So make sure you write this down if you haven't written anything else down. So when the Roman Empire fell, it left essentially a power vacuum in Europe, meaning it had been the big structure, the big institution that had been holding everything together. And when it fell, that job was now available. So that meant that the church stepped in to fill that power vacuum and to become the leading institution and the structure of Europe. And this, of course, is the Christian church. And at this point in history, there is only one Christian church, which is what we consider to more or less be the Catholic Church. We'll talk about the division of Christianity later on when we get to the Reformation. But the church was now able to provide some sense of cultural unity. It was able to provide spiritual comfort during a time when life was short and brutal and difficult. The church actually preserved the art of writing for European civilization. And as a result, it developed into a very, very powerful and very, very wealthy institution. And so, as a result, medieval Europe becomes deeply religious, deeply, deeply religious. So, you cannot discount the importance of Christianity in every aspect of European life and history from this point on. Then by the year 1000, we are moving into the High Middle Ages. And the High Middle Ages are about a 300-year period of history. And this is when we start to see some signs of recovery, some return of civilization, even the growth of more formal kingdoms, the growth and return of towns, the return of trade, the development of more complex government structures, and even a more complex social class system. So Europe and its civilization starts to recover. This is also what we consider to be the cultural height of the Middle Ages. So when you think of a lot of medieval stereotypes like chivalry and castles and court culture, that is really referring to the High Middle Ages. Also, major events like the Crusades, which we'll talk about in a later lecture, the development of medieval literature and early universities in Europe, and of course, the development of Gothic architecture and churches like Notre Dame Cathedral. But all throughout the High Middle Ages, the church continues to become even more powerful and even more influential. So, yes, we are seeing the resurgence of political and social and economic structures, but the church is still on top. The church is still the most powerful and influential institution in all of Europe, which still deeply influences European culture and European identity. And then finally, we close out the Middle Ages with the late Middle Ages or the late medieval period, which is a really disastrous and unfortunate 150 years. This period is defined by a series of disasters, starting with the Black Plague, followed by the Hundred Years' War between France and England, a major crisis in the church where there's lots of corruption and multiple popes. We'll talk about that another day. Poor harvests that lead to widespread famine and starvation, and also revolts from peasants across many big cities in Europe. Now, these disasters, are almost worse than the early medieval period. However, they provide an important turning point. They provide the transition for medieval into modern. So these many disasters actually led to the decline of manorialism and feudalism and the power of the church, right? So these major social and political institutions that had defined the Middle Ages start to decline. Remember, that's a gradual transition, it's a slow decline. And this is why some scholars argue that these series of misfortunes were actually necessary for bringing about the modern period. So if we look, that's it. Actually, that's it. Sorry. That is the end of the lecture. Okay. So at this point, you are done with the lecture, and hopefully you got all your notes in. The nice thing about lectures is you can always pause them, go back, rewind if you need to listen to something again. However, if you have any questions, right, or if you want me to go over something or explain something again, please make a note of that at the end of your notes so that you can ask me in our next class period. You will have another lecture to complete after this one, but thank you for listening and enjoy the rest of your day.